Hello, welcome everyone to today's Humanities in Action lecture, Black Women in Politics. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job to make sure that the excellent faculty, scholarship, and resources of the university are shared far and wide. And of course, we have wonderful brochures over there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about upcoming programs at the end today. But what I want to do is just sort of set us up a little bit. And I want to put up this picture here that accompanied an article entitled Meet the Black Woman Who Turned Georgia Blue. And this comes from the website representcollaborative.com. And what the whole point of the article was the deep engagement of Black women in this movement. Now, everyone might know Stacey Abrams here in the middle. And of course, I just realized you can't use the clicker against the screen. So remember that. I tried to point it out. But anyway, but there are others. So from top left, Latosha Brown, Stacey Abrams, and Nsea Foot, Melanie Campbell, Tamieka Atkins, Helen Butler, and Deborah Scott. So obviously it was more than just one person, and it's a deeply embedded movement. So when we think of this topic, Black women in politics, many of us will hearken back to the presidential or senatorial campaigns in Georgia and remember this incredible activism and organization of Black women to mobilize voters, in this case, particularly for Democratic candidates. Of course, many will also look at the triumph of our first female and first Black vice president, Kamala Harris. But the phenomena, as we're going to see today, is not limited to the races in offices that are more well known, but throughout the land, from local to state politics to the U.S. Congress and in many other official capacities. And we have a really great person joining us today to help us see the extent to which Black women are influencing American politics. So we're going to do that very soon. But the first thing I have to do is just a little bit of business and ask you to turn off your cell phones so they don't make any noise while we're doing this. And let me introduce our speaker. Christopher J. Clark is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Political Science Department right up here at Carolina. He received his BA from St. Louis University and his MA and PhD from the University of Iowa. His research interests include race and electoral representation in the United States and state politics and policy. Most of his research focuses on Black electoral representation, and he is especially interested in the creation and influence of Black political organizations, such as state legislative Black caucuses. He's the author of Gaining Voice, Causes and Consequences of Black Representation in the American States, and he has published extensively in journals such as State Politics and Policy Quarterly, Politics and Gender, American Politics Research, Political Research Quarterly, and Political Behavior. Now, from our perspective, the most important thing about our speaker today is that he is a public humanist par excellence and has always been very generous with his time with Carolina Public Humanities, coming and speaking just about every election cycle, and even in non-major election cycles. Here you are again today. So please put your hands together for Christopher Clark.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow, that's such a nice introduction here, Max. It's good to be back. It really is an honor to get a chance to speak. And so you said the clicker does work, Max, or doesn't? Okay. So I just wanted to, so my students just turned in papers to me, and I realized I didn't have my name on this. And I've had students turn in papers without names. I used to get on their case. But I figured y'all had a brochure. You knew it was me. Max introduced me, but I felt a little embarrassed. I'm like, man, who's presenting this exactly? So anyway, I always like to start off any presentation I give, whether it's an audience like yourself or in the classroom, justifying a topic. And so I often do this in my classes. So I teach a course on Southern politics. It almost teaches itself, but I do try to bring my own expertise to bear. There's always new material to engage with. And so I'm doing something I'm quite familiar with. And so, why Black women in politics? And so this idea of a single axis approach, I like to talk a little bit about, and the fact that it can render Black women invisible. So all I mean by single axis approach is that when you have studies that look at the impact of race or how Black people might experience politics, and so the idea of here in North Carolina, you can count on death, taxes, and fights over gerrymandering is often what I tell students. A few nods here. Okay, that'll work. So, but even that emphasis is on race and on the experience of Black people, okay? And then you often have people who look at gender in politics, and they'll look at the experiences of women and how might women get elected to office, and how important is it to recruit women to run for office. Well, what happens with these single axis approaches, where you look at only how does being Black impact some particular phenomenon? How does being a woman impact some phenomenon? You miss out on the fact that people who have multiple identities can get lost in these analyses. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is what seems to be true for women is true for white women, and what seems to be true for Black people is true more for Black men. And so this idea of a single axis approach, actually making Black women invisible, I remember learning when I was an undergrad some time ago at St. Louis University, earning a certificate in women's studies, and thinking about the debate over suffrage. And so who should get the right to vote first? Should it be Black people or should it be women? And from what I understand, the women's movement split over this question. But one of the things I remember learning is, oh my goodness, it turns out that for Black women to get the right to vote, both Black people and women had to get the right to vote. And so that whole conversation essentially rendered Black women invisible. And so that's something that continues to happen in research and in political science research today. I'll say that more towards the end. But anyway, it's a broader phenomenon. At the expense of stating the obvious, Black women are affected both by their racial identity and their gender identity. And so I think it's important to take a look at women of color who are in these multiple minority groups and to think about how they experience politics. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of my own work. I'll also try to put in, talk with you a bit about extant research that other people have done that I think is really important. And so without further ado, let's keep going. So Shirley Chisholm. All right, I'm a huge fan of Shirley Chisholm. One of my co-authors told me that UNC Press just this year published a book on Shirley Chisholm. I'm like, how did I miss that? I mean, I was a little embarrassed. I'm like, kind of at UNC, right? I mean, the press, I could, if I had a good arm, I could probably throw a rock and hit the press from my building. And so I haven't read it yet, but I plan on reading it. It's on my list. But back when I was in undergrad, I wrote a women's, my capstone project for my women's studies certificate looked at Shirley Chisholm, Eleanor Holmes Norton, and Barbara Jordan. And I looked at this argument or this framework called Black feminist thought that Patricia Hill Collins developed. And I use that framework to look at their political careers. And so I wish I still had it. I think, back then, technology changes. I had like that 3.5 floppy disk. I don't know where that is now. And so in some ways I might be embarrassed to see just how inadequate my prose was as as an undergrad. But anyway, I go way back in terms of how much I really admire Chisholm. So when she was elected in the 91st Congress. So I don't know how many of you speak Congress. So whenever I talk about Congresses, I try to, if I'm thoughtful, try to add the year. So 1969, okay. This Brooklyn lawmaker made history, becoming the first Black woman ever to serve in Congress. So I often tell my students this, and so I want to talk with you all as well in the same way, because I know you get it. You're bright people. I don't want to be patronizing in any way, but it doesn't. The 91st Congress. That means there were 90. That means 180. Let me state my frame. 180 years of people sitting in a room and debating and marking up bills and passing laws that impacted the lives of all Americans, including Black women, without a Black woman being in that position of power. Okay, so she ran for president in 1972. She did come up short. McGovern wound up winning the nomination. McGovern didn't fare that well. Nixon wiped him. It wasn't very close. I should use academic language, right? It wasn't very close. All right. You could say that Nixon had a mandate after that election. All right, because he won by such a large margin. What's important here is Chisholm made history as well, becoming, by many accounts, I think, as far as I'm concerned and others, the first Black person to make a serious bid at running for the presidency. And so, years later, you had Jesse Jackson in 84 and 88. And then, of course, Obama in 08, right? He won and then was reelected in 2012. And so she's a pioneer, both in terms of Black women serving in Congress and then also Black presidential politics as a whole. Okay? I do want to note here that her race and her gender impacted her experience when running for president in 1972. I'm happy if you have questions to talk a bit more about that. It's something that comes up in one of my classes that I teach. So I should be able to give you a couple of points at least to help back that up a bit. While she was in Congress, she helped to establish 2 different identity-based caucuses, going back to that term of single-axis caucuses. So here, a Black caucus, focusing on issues of Black Americans. 1971, she was one of the founding members, the CBC. And then 6 years later, the Congressional Caucus for Women's Interests emerged. And she was also a key player in the creation of that group. We'll talk about Barbara Lee again. One thing that I want to highlight here, and I don't have a lot about my current project here. It's under review. Not that I think any of you are going to review it. Maybe you're reviewers. I shouldn't speak too soon, right, Max? I'm always careful about work that's under review. So anyway, Chisholm inspired Barbara Lee, and part of Barbara Lee's story is actually working on the 1972 campaign on behalf of Chisholm. So Barbara Lee is a Black woman, a Democratic lawmaker from California. So that D is Democrat, CA, California. I always like to be clear about the thing. That's just sort of code for people who study the House or Congress. And it turns out that Chisholm really inspired other lawmakers. So Yvette Clarke. So I'm Clarke without an E. And I'm not blaming Representative Clarke, for this, but she's a Clarke with an E. And so oftentimes when I meet people, I say Chris Clarke without an E. I shouldn't be blaming a sitting member of Congress. Shut up. Anyway, Yvette Clarke, here's my point, is also from New York, from Brooklyn. And she also looks up to Shirley Chisholm. And so you can think about the legacy of Shirley Chisholm and her inspiring other Black women lawmakers who have followed in her footsteps. And so I have a paper under review that makes that claim and talks about some specific members. I believe Cori Bush is also someone else from St. Louis, who also has kind of come to prominence in terms of how she brings her experiences to Congress and advocates on behalf of the marginalized. All right. That's just the first slide. How long do I have, Max? You said 40 minutes? I'm going to save time for Q&A. I knew if I just had 5 slides, I could talk 40 minutes. So I was cognizant of that. Let's take a closer look at Black women in Congress, okay? Again, I don't have to explain myself. These numbers are staggering to me. I like numbers. And what I like about these kind of numbers is that it says a lot. You don't have to run some fancy regression. It says a lot. I still want to put it in the context. So 59 ever. So we're talking the first Congress to now. 31 are currently, all right, in Congress. So 31 Black women are currently in Congress. So I was thinking, how do I indicate sort of the denominator, right? Like, what does this 59 mean without knowing how many people in general have served in Congress? About 11,000. So again, you don't need a PhD in political science to say, oh, wow, that's a really small percentage, much smaller than the population share of Black women. Okay, and so a group that's been grossly underrepresented in Congress. I suppose the silver lining is that we're seeing more and more Black women throw their hat in the ring and get elected to Congress. So I want to just give you like a negative story, right? Over time, this number is increasing. In terms of partisanship, oh, good, that italics is showing up the way I was hoping. Uno, one. I don't know. I took French. I shouldn't try too many different languages, right? One of these Black women has been associated with the Republican Party. Mia Love, who served a couple of terms, she was from the state of Utah. I believe a Haitian immigrant. Anyway, I don't have to tell you Mia Love's life story. But the point I want to make here is that there definitely is a partisan angle here, right? When you only have 1 out of 59, I mean, first of all, 59 is a really abysmally low number, but it's not as if you've had 12 Black women serve as Republicans, all right? So Mia Love is definitely an outlier. And so we'll see that come up a little bit later in terms of Black women and their attachment to the Democratic Party. Let's talk a little bit about a paper I wrote. I collected all these data. In fact, during the height of COVID, I was on the website, and it kind of helped me, right, to do something tangible and something related to research when my kids were at home and doing the Zooms to school and yelling at me for snacks. Anyway, I shouldn't go back. I'm having flashbacks, but I collected these data in a difficult time, and it was nice to see a paper come out of it. A couple of things I want to highlight here. When looking at up through the 117th Congress, I think at that point, maybe 52 Black women had served, okay? Somewhere around 50. 2 things I'd like to share with you all. First, prior to serving in Congress, many of these actors came out of the world of education. Either they were principals or school teachers, but were from the world of education. I think that's neat in terms of thinking about, right? Were they lawyers? Were they involved in business? Were they judges? Like, where did they come from? What set of experiences are they bringing to Congress? And so education. I guess as an educator, I find that to be really neat as well. I mean, who am I kidding? And so there's that to note. And then the other note, and I think especially in a state like North Carolina, where you have a large number of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, thinking about the role of Black Greek letter organizations. All right, so these fraternities and sororities that exist, they came about because Blacks weren't able to be part of the traditional, predominantly white Greek letter organizations, really having this emphasis on service and giving back to the community, right? But also having a way for middle class and upper class Black people who were in college, that had that same kind of experience that others, right, that whites were able to have in these fraternities and sororities. Other people have shown the importance of these Black Greek letter organizations in terms of providing Black women with the skills and the resources and the ability, skills and resources that will help them in terms of actually running for office and serving in Congress. So it's just not lost on us that these organizations play such a pivotal role in terms of the Black women who are in Congress. Okay, so let's. If you thought representation in the House was abysmal, well, well. Okay, so so wait, good news. LaFonza Butler. So we're up to 3. The same number of Stooges. I don't know. I grew up watching the 3 Stooges. I just thought you all might appreciate that line. That's interesting. I don't know if I want the number of a particular group to. And again, I love the comedy. I don't know. Maybe it says something about me, right? That just kind of hit me in real time. That's just. I almost put it on the slide, but y'all are hearing it. 3 Black women ever have served. I can't tell you the denominator. Gave me time. I could look it up or something. But we're talking a fair number of people, right? Not 3 out of 10, right? I mean. This is a big denominator, so really, really quite awful. But Butler, I should say, is from California. Okay, she was appointed by Devin Newsom. Newsom essentially promised people that he would appoint a Black woman to the U.S. Not U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. Senate. I think in part because now VP Harris was in that role before resigning to become vice president. So anyway, what we know is Butler is now in the Senate. She's bringing some diversity as well, so showing some what I would call heterogeneity, a fancy way of saying some of the differences that exist among Black women within the community of Black women. She's a member of the LGBTQ plus community. And so that fact makes her a pioneer not only among California U.S. senators, but out of the total 12 Black people who have ever served in the U.S. Senate, she's the only one who is in fact a member of the LGBTQ plus community. That's the other thing. So this is a talk on Black women. So I want to be careful not to go off track, which is it's a fight for me every time I'm in front of an audience. But 12, it's not a typo. So I don't know. I mean, we're in the South, like I say, same number of disciples. I don't know, 12, a dozen. I mean, right? The same kind of number of donuts you get at Krispy Kreme. That's a North Carolina establishment, right? That's the total number of Black people who have ever served in the U.S. Senate. Obama was one of them, so I guess that's the silver lining, right? Obama, but a really low number. Okay. This is the part that I find super, super interesting. And this is playing out in real time. Let me take a sip of water here. So Adam Schiff, who is a name that you might be familiar with in terms of former President Trump, and then some of how he would engage with Schiff. Katie Porter, who's known for her not antics, but her behavior in hearings and like driving a minivan. She very much relates to like the struggling parent who just knows what it's like to be busy and to be overwhelmed. And then the aforementioned Barbara Lee. All of these folks want the seat that now is available because Dianne Feinstein passed away. So Feinstein, who's a trailblazer in her own right, okay, served decades in the Senate. So now there's an open Senate seat. And 3 high-profile individuals on the Democratic side, okay, are seeking to serve in that seat. And so, I don't want to diminish the presence of Senator Butler. It's also the case that she could be seen more as a placeholder, as opposed to someone who will permanently be in that seat. Now, she may surprise me, and you might say, Chris, you were wrong, right? She beat them all, and she held on to that seat. That could very well be the case. These folks all, though, it's going to be a tough election. And I don't know how much advantage she'll get as an incumbent, in part because she was appointed, okay? It'll be something for you to pay attention to. So I actually don't know the answer to that, right? Because I don't think Newsom can tell her she can't, right? But I would have to think she understands that all these folks. In fact, Barbara Lee was hoping to get appointed and was not happy. Yeah, so I appreciate your question. It's it's going to be really interesting. I can't imagine that she should just step aside. I mean, you're a U.S. senator. You get one out of 100, right? So it'll be interesting to see. Okay, governors. Oh, I love talking. I love talking governors, especially my Southern politics class. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I guess we just keep going lower, don't we? Like we start off with 59, and then we went to 3. I mean, that's how many points I've scored, in the NBA, right? 0, right? So I never made the league. I mean, that's how many black women governors that we've had. This is just how I'm wired. I'm going to have fun with this, okay? It makes me sad, but I'm trying to make a point. Not a single one. Now, the next bullet points are meant to unpack the fact that it isn't for a lack of effort or a lack of trying, but I also don't want to move too quickly, from this first bullet point. I mean, to me, that's staggering because we're talking I guess we added 2 states, 1959, right? So, but right again, I don't have to go through all the process of when states were added, right? It's not a history lesson. But the point is, there have been ample opportunities for black women to become governor. I think it stands to reason that not just because of the second bullet point, but that prior to 2018, black women sought to become governor, and yet were unsuccessful. And so it's a really big deal to think that not a single one. So there have been some black governors. You all may remember L. Douglas Wilder, our neighbor to the north, Virginia. Deval Patrick in Massachusetts. Okay, but look, this is not a talk about brothers, though, right? Or about black people as a whole. These are black men. Wes Moore was just elected, but not a single black woman. Okay, so Abrams, who, thank you, Max, for mentioning Stacey Abrams. She lost not once but twice to Brian Kemp. It was much closer in 2018 than in 2022. I have some thoughts about that. I'm happy to share if you all have questions. There's this great book about African-American statewide candidates by Charles Bullock and some co-authors. I assigned this book in my Southern politics class. And so in the 2018 election cycle, she received a lot of support from black people, which is not surprising given what political scientists have shown. Some of my own work shows us as well that black voters are often the strongest supporters of black candidates, wanting to see yourself reflected in government, and then also for non-black voters or a subset of white voters, an unwillingness to vote for black candidates. I can unpack that later if you'd like. But the point is, a lot of black people in Georgia supported her, which is consistent with what political scientists would expect. Metro Atlanta, I mean, Atlanta's a world-class city, right? And urban areas tend to support Democratic candidates, tend to be more tolerant areas on average. And so she received a lot of support from Metro Atlanta. And then younger people were excited by her campaign. And so those were, if you were thinking, okay, who were the people that were strongly behind Stacey Abrams when she first ran for governor? Those would be some of the groups that you'd want to highlight. Okay, and then I think I almost had this on the slide, and I thought you could also infer that the groups that are opposite from these were the least supportive of her, and that would be a fair thing to conclude. Okay. Oh, now Iowa. I went to school. I love the Hawkeye State, so I was really interested. I'm like, wow, a black woman made the general election in Iowa. Oh my God, Iowa! Wow. Only about 3% or so of the population is black in Iowa. So you usually expect black candidates to emerge in states like Georgia, where about 1/3 of the population is black, or Alabama, where about 25% of the population is black. Not necessarily the Hawkeye State. So anyway, DeGere and then Yolanda Flowers, in the 2022 election cycle, both ran. They were able to win the primary, their respective primaries, but they both came up short. Now, what I think is interesting, which complicates this a bit, is that they both lost to incumbent Republican women. So when Abrams lost to Kemp in 2022, he was an incumbent. And so he had that built-in advantage. He had a record that he could point to. And it's just hard to beat people who are already in office. Okay. 2018, it was open. He wasn't. And so that wasn't a factor. Okay. But in 2022, and so he's a white male Republican. And so there is some diversity in terms of gender. Kim Reynolds and Kay Ivey, so Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, Ivey, the governor of Alabama, they were the ones who bested DeGere and Flowers, okay? Those elections were not that competitive. That's probably me trying to be a little nice. But the fact is, look, here's the last point I want to make. And I'm struck by this, and I've been thinking a lot about this, both as an instructor and as a researcher. So here's the good news is that Black women can now win Democratic primaries. If I weren't worried about hurting my hand, because I kind of get excited and I want to be able to drive home, right? I would slap this. That's a big deal. Because decades ago, that would not be true. So that's huge. And so I want to acknowledge that. People at home, I want to acknowledge that. The tricky part about this, and I think Abrams really shows this really well, is it's to get over that hump and win the general election, to become the governor of a state. It's yet, well, go back to the first bullet point. It hasn't happened yet. And so I don't have the bullet points here, but the fact is, there is a penalty that Black candidates face, this tax, for lack of a better term. So by virtue of being Black, they're expected to earn a lower percentage of votes. Run fancy regression models, allow us to conclude, lead to that conclusion. But there's also a gender effect as well, where questions about the role of women, should women be in the private sphere or the public sphere? Are women strong and tough enough to govern a state? I mean, those questions are still out there. And so those things combined are impacting Wyatt Abrams, right? The experience that Stacey Abrams has, and that DeJear has, and that Yolanda Flowers has. So it's not just race, it's not just gender, it's both of these things. And so there are two obstacles that you have to overcome. And that's part of the difficulty. I added this slide today. I hope there are no typos. We'll see. If not, I hope you all are forgiving. But I figured, I got to the end, I said, I got to talk about Justice Jackson. I mean, I can't have a talk on Black women in politics and not mention the first Black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. Oh my goodness! Like, I've got to give her some shine, as we would say growing up. So here it is. But even broader than Judge Jackson, there's some recent work by Tanisha Means, and the findings are I find troubling. I also think it's important that she does this work because she allows us now to know, how do Black women judges at the state level, what do they accept? What is true of their experience? How do people engage with them? So she talks about the fact that Black women who have gone through the process and the education and the training to become a judge still experience disrespect. They get called names that I won't say here because I want to keep it, keep the rating a certain way, but awful names that people may call women. And the second point, this is their competence is questioned. We'll get that. I'll remind me in case I don't get to that with Judge Jackson. I want to make sure I'll get back to that point when I talk about Judge Jackson. But and the part I think is I find so disturbing and so frustrating is they've got, right, they have the education, they have the training, they have the experience to become a judge. And one would think, okay, after going through the rigors of that, you would at least, Your Honor, you would be referred to in that way instead of by some other title. And yet it's still the case that they experience disrespect. And good people, all right? I'd be remiss to not mention the second bullet point that Dr. Means, her research reveals, is that who are the culprits? Who are the key players in this disrespect that's taking place? Predominantly white male attorneys are the ones who are treating Black women judges in this way. I don't think it makes a bit of difference. So that's something to think about in terms of the negative experiences. And I think one of the other sad things that I feel sad about when reading this paper is there's almost a sense of resignation, is my sense, among the judges, where, I mean, it's just the way things are. And I find that troubling. Okay, Judge Jackson. Not like this is necessarily going to become a better, a more positive story, but I was talking to Max before the talk, and I was looking at some highlights from the hearing of Judge Jackson. So in spring of 2022 is when she had her confirmation hearings. I was going back and forth between nomination and confirmation. I hope you all get the gist of what I'm communicating here. And I don't know how much you all followed this, but there was this real emphasis on some decisions that she made in terms of sentencing people because of child pornography. And let's talk about, well, so Cruz is Latino. So it's more of a partisan thing. But Senator Lindsey Graham was someone that had gone after. Josh Hawley, my home state of Missouri, was someone else. But then also there was Cruz, and so really there was this partisan element to how she was treated and how her decisions about how long she sent people to how long she imprisoned them or what have you. That being called into question. Although, and you all you can fact check me on this, okay? I had some students tell me this in class, and they showed me the source. I wish I put it up here. That I think Judge Jackson, if she's not the most, she is one of the most qualified people to ever serve in the U.S. Supreme Court. If you look at her record and all the different roles she's held, the fact that she went to a public school, I mean, it was just even more remarkable. I mean, so someone who, because of their previous experience, one would think their credentials would not be questioned, because if you if you've done all these roles, it would suggest you have competence. So I'll come back to this a little later when I think about what we can learn about the experiences of Judge Jackson and other Black women judges in terms of political science, right? And how I think the discipline could benefit. Okay, when I say brief, I mean brief, in part because I know the least about local politics. All right. So I may direct you elsewhere if you have questions about this, or maybe I'll be able to answer them. So I live in Durham, about 20 minutes or so from here, South Durham. And so as of now, because yesterday was the primary in Durham, there were some seats up for grabs, including the mayor seat, mayoral. There was a seat for mayor, and then also a few seats for the city council. So this first point is really important, and what I want to communicate here is, generally speaking, across the country, Blacks are not in office at a rate that reflects the Black population share. And so I've looked at some of this in state legislatures in my own work, looking at representation ratios. So the fact that Durham, even though it has a sizable Black population, the fact that the majority of the city council is Black, that's a huge deal. Because and one reason why that's a big deal is because it means that to the extent that the Black city council members are unified, they can enact the policies that they want because they have the numbers. So they can advocate for interests that will potentially uplift the Black community and so forth. Okay. So that being said, Elaine O'Neill, who is a Black woman, decided not to run for re-election. So the current mayor will not be mayor for too much longer. And partly it's because of some of the negative experiences that she had while in office. Let's continue on this. Let's continue discussing this. So another Black woman who serves on the city council, Monique Holsey Hyman, okay, was accused of extortion. This was, News and Observer and some of the other newspapers covered this in some detail. And offhand, I don't remember all the specifics, but it's this question about her. Yeah, she faced these criminal charges. I mean, that's quite a thing to be accused of, right? She was actually cleared not too long ago. So the SBI, there was an investigation, and it turns out that there were no grounds, right? And so it basically was nothing came of it. Well, at least in terms of criminal charges. I was looking at the election results this morning, or last night. I forget when I was looking at them. Maybe it was this morning, because I sent this this morning. She was one of the candidates running in the city council election to maintain her seat, and she was not one of the top three to advance. Now, again, sometimes I feel like political science says things that are so obvious. It's like, wow, they're paying us money. Like, people are taking their time and energy to hear me tell them this. I still think it's worth saying, okay? I can't help but think her being accused of extortion, right? I haven't run a model. I haven't set up a design to rule out other explanations. But I think that there's something there, okay? And it's not lost on me that, right, she faces these charges, and then despite the fact that she's an incumbent, she doesn't move forward. Okay, so the other thing that's super interesting about this, and this allows me to talk about something I think is important to keep in mind as well, in terms of Black politics and why I think it's important to look at Black women specifically, is that some of the people who were critics of both Elaine O'Neill and Councilmember Holsey Hyman were other Black people. So you all could do some digging. Let's just say other incumbent Black politicians in Durham were key actors in terms of some of these negative experiences to these Black women, political elites. And so some of what they faced. So many things I could say about this. What I'll focus on is the following, which is something I remember learning in undergrad, right? Thinking about the difference that gender makes when understanding and when thinking about Black politics. So it could be easy to say, oh yeah, Blacks are underrepresented. There's going to be this the shared set of experiences, this linked fate. It's a term sometimes people use. And yet, when you look at Black women and you see the example, some of what happened with Mayor O'Neill and this other council member, and when Black men, maybe I should have said Black man, shouldn't I? I was trying to be broader. Black men are criticizing them, and there's some strife. It's not as if Black men can't be patriarchal and sexist. Not that I have to, well, I don't know how political I could be in these statements. Let's just see the November 2024 gubernatorial election. I'll say it that way, and I hope you all are following what I'm getting at here. If not, we can talk about it here. I don't know how, well, this is just a public humanities talk, right, Max? I know, but I'm just these recordings, but right, it's not as if, right, Black men can't behave in this way, right? And so I think that's important to keep in mind. All right, skin tone and hair. So actually, my friend and co-author Nadia Brown is really the brains behind this study. And so, taking a look at this book that she co-authored with Danielle Lemmy, and what I love about this book is that it takes something that many Black people, I think, know to be true, and then she writes an incredible political science book about this topic. Because I think for a lot of people, if you say, "Oh yeah, I'm looking at the politics of hair," they might say, "Well, wait, what? Like hair? What?" It's partisanship, right? And other things that might influence how candidates is perceived and so forth. And yet, what her and Lemmy are able to show is that actually skin tone and then hair texture. Do you have straightened hair, or do you have curly hair, or do you have locks? I have very little hair now. I just had a fresh haircut because I wanted to look presentable today. We can talk about that later if you like, but it affects how Black women are evaluated. Okay, so it's a whole book, a 2021 Oxford University Press book called Sister Style. There's a colon. I forget what comes after. I just know the first part. All right, that's the part that kind of gets people's attention. Sister Style. So Black women themselves, and in particular, Black women political elites, when you ask them, when you talk with them, they believe their appearance affects how they're evaluated. So the actors who are throwing their hat in the ring, right? They believe that their appearance matters. So I think that's the first thing to know. The second, I kind of cherry picked. Who am I kidding? But if they looked at the Black women who ran in the 2018 election cycle, and they looked across levels of analysis, all right, local, state, federal. Okay, oh my gosh, this is interesting. I'm intrigued by this. That if you look at the Black women who made it to that stage, they tended to have straight hair, and they tended to be fair skin. And so this whole question about fair skin, and you may have heard the term, or maybe you haven't, colorism is sometimes thrown around, this idea of your phenotype affecting how people evaluate you. Growing up in a Black community, and I mean, I feel like I it's kind of in my bones in terms of I can remember people talking about people being light and lighter skin, and that. Well, but then that had, I remember being older and realizing, oh wait, that has roots to slavery. Well, like I had no clue. I'm just a kid in Kansas City with my family and seeing these differences about, good hair versus not, lighter skin versus not. And then I realized when I was older, oh my goodness, it's tied to this deeper phenomenon. So anyway, Eurocentric beauty standards is a term that they use throughout the book. The point I think is worth noting here is that who are the folks who when looking at candidate emergence, the fact that the Black women the fact that this is true, I think is noteworthy. Especially if we think about a Stacey Abrams, who neither, right, has lighter skin nor, right, straight hair. So she would be an outlier. But if you look at the entire population of folks, this is what you find. All right, I'm getting there. Okay. This is a shorter slide in part because I mean, I guess I could talk more about it if you all would like. I was looking at some data. I think some of this is from Pew and some other sources. So 94, that's when you have 94% of a group act one way, that's a big deal. That's almost 19 out of 20. I mean, oh my gosh. Black women were really, very supportive of Hillary Clinton. Now, again, I want to have a point of reference here, because if I just tell you that without telling you something about either women or Black people as a whole, I feel like it's not as helpful. And so the comparison point is about 89% of Blacks. So what that tells us is that Black women were voting at a greater rate for Hillary Clinton as compared to Black men. Same trend in 2020. All right. In terms of support for Joe Biden. And then for those who follow presidential politics, this isn't necessarily, it's more anecdote, but I think it's true. I mean, Black people saved Joe Biden's presidential campaign. Black people in South Carolina, Jim Clyburn, and the Black voters of South Carolina, because going up until Super Tuesday and I'm laughing. I should like. I'm going back in time and thinking about the Iowa caucuses in New Hampshire. Biden did not do well, but South Carolina really brought it home for him, and Black voters in particular. So I just thought I'd add that, and to really bring home this point that I would say. Many people say, "Oh, Blacks are key to the Democratic Party." Yeah, that's true compared to other groups. Of course, I would agree. I think a more precise statement is that Black women, in particular, are the backbone of the Democratic Party, in the way that they are, in many ways, the backbone of the Black community as a whole. But this isn't a talk about criminal justice. But let me just throw that out there. We can come back to that if you like. How the criminal justice system makes that statement even more true. All right, good people, we're getting there. Let's see. Oh, all right, I'm getting there. Do I? Okay, I just want to make sure, man. I can talk, man. So let's talk about Black women in legislative caucuses. So I have a current project. I've been in the works for a while with Nadia Brown and our other friend and co-author Anna Mahoney. I'm bringing you back. See, now I'm testing you all here. See, I added single axis and identity based. See, this was me being the egghead. This is my egghead slide. I try not to use jargon unnecessarily. But again, if you go back to single axis, meaning based just on one identity, so race or gender, what we were trying to figure out is, okay, here are Black women who can be members of both the Black Caucus and the Women's Caucus. How do they, as members, as Black women, experience these organizations that are single axis in nature, that only seem to be interested in Black interests or women's interests in terms of their very design? So interviews are being conducted, and we're collecting data, and we're trying to figure out like how much of a leadership role Black women had. Like how often is it you have a Black woman chair a women's caucus? How often do you see Black women chair Black caucuses? Just to get a sense of how that plays out. Is it mostly white women leading the women's caucuses? Is it mostly Black men leading the Black caucuses? And if so, that tells us something important about Black women and the power that they wield and their experience in the political sphere. Initially, a number of years ago when we started this, I had this idea about bridges, and I did Black women could potentially be bridges between these caucuses because literally they're members of both. And so how much are they trying to get these caucuses to work together and to collaborate? And so far, the data we're collecting suggests that it doesn't necessarily pan out that way, but that's a research process. That's one of the things I love about my job. You learn something new. I have an idea and it may not pan out. That's okay. We still learn something. So that's been neat. And the other thing too that we find interesting is the need for a Black women's caucus. How much is there a need for a Black women's caucus? And so I'll provide a little bit more information here, maybe to flesh this out. So you have a state like Maryland, which is one of the states that we're studying. And in Maryland, you have a lot of women. The state is about 30% Black. I'm trying to remember here. I don't want to get this data point wrong, but a lot of the Black women state legislators actually serve in Maryland. Like they have a ridiculous proportion of Black women lawmakers. The Speaker of the House recently, if not currently, is a Black woman. And so Black women wield a lot of power in a setting like that. And so one of the things that we've learned is that there's no need for a Black women's caucus because Black women hold leadership positions and they have strength in numbers. So you don't need a separate entity to advocate. You can just work within the system, which we didn't know that ahead of time until we started doing our work. But then also you have other settings where maybe that's less the case. And so maybe it could be that the more marginalized Black women feel, the less they feel like the existing caucus structure works. That might lead to the emergence of a separate Black women's caucus. So we don't know, but we're trying to figure some of these things out. So it's ongoing research. Hopefully in a couple of years, I don't know, maybe a couple of years I'll come back, Max, and say, look, this book I talked about, here 2025, I would love that. And yeah, we have a lot of pieces. Okay. Kamala Harris, VP Harris. And then, yep, we'll end with the future. So Max already told you all this. So thank you, Max. Made history, all right, in 2020. I don't know. Oh, I love what I get to do for a living. So I get to tell these stories, right? And so if you know some of this, then right, maybe we're on the same page. And if not, look this stuff up. I mean, you just can't make some of this up. But I remember in the exchange in the debate between then Senator Harris and then VP Biden, where Biden is talking about his ability to, he worked with across the aisle with people in terms of busing and I think like local control or something like that. And he was basically showing how he was able to work across the aisle with folks who were racially conservative, I think is a nice way of putting it. And Harris said, well, wait a second, like, that kid that was on the bus and that was me. And she just had this moment where she totally owned Joe Biden. And he kind of gave some answer and he's like, my time is up. And it was just, you just can't create those. So look it up, folks. I mean, he's conceding here. Anyway, it was just really wild. So I think she shot up the polls shortly thereafter, and then it didn't last. But it makes me think like the power of one's own story, and then thinking about her being multiracial and right, and just thinking about her relationship with her sister. Right? Anyway, just this whole idea of here's someone who isn't a white guy, who's in this position of power, and just how that can inspire people, right? And how I think many people were drawn to her, at least a subset of folks were drawn to her story, and I think there's a lot of power to that. And then there's a paper that I keep mentioning Lemmy, but Lemmy and some co-authors actually have this really cool design. And the key thing I want to communicate to you all is not the design. I'm not here to talk about survey experiments and all that, but depending on how they had this a survey of Indian Americans. And so because all these labels could be confusing, because right, American Indian means Native Americans, what we used to call Native Americans, and well, let me not confuse you. Let me just make my point. Okay, I'm talking about South Asian people. All right, so Indian people from South Asia, not to be confused with American Indians, who we consider folks who are indigenous to the U.S. That's what I was trying to say. But anyway, in a survey where Harris was framed, so where people read a story about Harris and only talked about her as Indian American, so her South Asian heritage, they were more supportive of a Biden-Harris ticket when she was framed as someone who was also in the same group that they were. But when Harris was framed as multiracial, when people read about her in this way, they were less supportive of her. So anyway, I'm getting more in the weeds maybe than I need to. The point is, how you're framed and how you're perceived matters. And what this suggests is that even though she's both Black and South Asian, she can't like split herself in half. Okay, this is my South Asian half, this is my Black half, right? It's who she is, right? That some people value, right, some aspects of her identity more than others. And in this case, other South Asian people, at least in the survey, appear to value that aspect, that shared identity, more so than her having this multiracial identity. So let's talk about the future. I do think it's bright. It may not have sounded like it based off of things I've said so far, but I really do believe he's looking up for Black women, and in particular, political elites. Okay. One thing that I like, a trend that I've seen, is more and more political science research is looking at these questions, looking at things intersectionally. Intersectional research is another term that's thrown around some. I think it's a much needed step in the right direction. And then the last thing I want to say here is I really think it's true that as you have more and more Black women emerge in powerful positions, so you have a Judge Jackson, and people look at her confirmation hearing, and oh, I didn't mention this earlier. Maybe I was saving it. When you juxtapose Judge Jackson's confirmation hearing with that of Brett Kavanaugh, I'm telling, like, I don't want to get your blood pressure up, but I'm telling, like, you can't, and you all are smart people, you don't have to do a whole lot of training to see, wait a second, who's the angry one? Who's the one interrupting the actual nominee in the case of Kavanaugh? So again, y'all, I'm gonna spell it out. I know y'all might have been there already, but I'm gonna spell it out. And you watch Jackson, and she's on the receiving, like it's the Harleys, Cruz. I mean, he's just, you took my time, Durbin. I mean, he's like giving Durbin the business and just talking over him. She's not the angry one. And that speaks to these broader things about who has permission to be angry and how that's affected by race, how that's affected by gender. The point I want to make here, good people, is that I think for people who study the U.S. Supreme Court, and who study confirmation hearings, they now have some data where they can say, wait a second, let's compare these two and let's see what we learned. I would love to read that paper. More broadly, the idea is that now, you can look at her opinions. Are her opinions, do they differ in some way from other actors? And how much can we attribute that to her identity, right? Or her shared set of experiences? Maybe they aren't any different. Maybe they're just, or maybe they're more like Sotomayor's because they're both women of color, as opposed to, there's a lot you could do. Say now I'm being a nerd, but there's so much we can learn. All right, now that you have Black women in these positions of power, how much of VP Harris's people's views of her and reception of her, how much of that is a function of her identity? And there are ways to disentangle that. Not easy questions, but now we can ask the question because she's there. Whereas before, it was all in your head and you couldn't do it. So I'm excited to see, in particular, how much do these existing theories we have of politics, how much do they morph? How much do they shift based off the fact that now we have different people in these positions of power? And I'm excited about that. So with that, oh, you know what? You talked for a few minutes, Max. I forgot about that. So I feel less bad that.
Doing fantastic. Let's put our hands together for Christopher Clark. And we have plenty of time for questions. We'll take questions from the in-house audience first, but I want to remind our folks out in the ether that there is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we welcome your questions from the online audience as well. But let's start with the in-house audience. Do we have any questions? Sam.
Kamala Harris as on the ticket in 2024. There's been so much, the Republicans have made so much out of the fact that this really is an election between whoever is running on the Republican side and Kamala Harris, because they say Joe Biden is going to die any day now. To what extent do you think if she was removed as the vice presidential candidate, that there would be a backlash in the African-American community and among African-American women in particular?
I think my sense is that there would be, right? And I think reasonably so, right? I mean, and again, I don't study vice presidential politics as much, right? Actually, you know what? I think, Sam, to answer your question, but first of all, I think there would be, because right, she's been in that position. In a way she could be better. Sure, that's true. You can say that about any politician, right? I think a key part of that would be who would be the replacement. Now, again, because I think there would just be this baseline back, like frustration and anger, like, wait, right? You brought us along and now you drop us? I mean, why would you? That's not okay, right? Especially given that Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, right? So I think that would be a really difficult, path forward, right? If Biden were to do that. And I think it will become especially difficult if he replaced her with another existing white male senator or someone, right? Like that. Saying that, I got to keep it. I've been cussing more, but it will not go well, right? Because the Democratic Party is the party of diversity, right? And if you put, I'm so tempted to name names. I always get in trouble with that, right? But just doesn't even matter. I think that would be it'll be a lot of blowback, like above and beyond. Oh, it was about Max. I like you, Max. I got nothing against you, man. It might help. It might help. It might not be as much, right, Sam? But I still think it would be Black women would feel, right? I would understand. I think I would feel that way too. Like, wait a second, like, okay, I know the person's not perfect, but wow, like especially with all the excitement around 2020 and who's the replacement? I think would go a long way towards just how difficult it would be. No, I appreciate that. I'll keep thinking about that.
We have a question here from Tom.
You opened the door to nerdy questions. So here's one. You talk about the two single axes, men and women. And I assume someone's done some electability numbers and it's gone up as the country's become more diverse and so on. If you added those two vectors and came up with the Black women, are they ahead or behind of what you might expect?
Oh, that's a good question. So, so the question about electability, Tom, is an interesting one. So so I literally, 2 weeks ago, read some papers on this. So, there's a word for it now. It's like the preference expectation gap or something like that. And so what's interesting though, from a gender standpoint, is that people prefer women candidates, but relative to man candidates, but they expect women candidates not to do as well. They expect that they don't believe they are as electable. And so you end up with people. So I think a great example of this is Elizabeth Warren. If you actually looked at people's favorability, they like, whoa, she's smart. Oh, I would, but she won't win. And so I don't know if that directly answers your question, but to the extent that that is true for Black women as women, right? I think that would make, that preference expectation gap, I think, would make it difficult, relative to Black men, at least. And then I think, I mean, honestly, I haven't ran the numbers yet, but given what I said, what I know to be true about the penalty of the Black candidates face as well, I mean, you put those two together and it would suggest, I mean, it is harder for Black women to win relative to Black men and relative to white women. So, yeah. No, I think so. I think this is a terrible joke to make. I hope you all don't throw me out, but it's this term called generational replacement. And so generational replacement is just a nice way of saying old, and some, older people, and then those who have some of the more negative racial views no longer, right? They die, and with them, right, some of these views die, and younger generations become, right, replace them and are more progressive. But even as I say that to you all, there's a book about millennials by a friend. She used to work at UNC, now she works at the school down the road that we won't name. The small community college. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and so it's about millennials, and what she shows is that they just the existing measures of racial animus don't really fit for younger people, but there still is some of those negative attitudes there. So I just cut out my own argument I made. Why did I do that? I'm an educator. What can I say? But no, I appreciate what you're saying. I think here's another positive way. Abrams was this close to becoming governor with all the shenanigans about Kemp, and he didn't resign for being Secretary of State, and then purging voters. I mean, it just was a complete fiasco. And she still came that close. Anyway, I love that you said vectors. That was great. Nice work.
We have the science over in the corner over there. Every question.
Thanks. So you didn't mention Letitia James.
Oh.
And you didn't mention Fannie Willis. So if you went down one more layer to the rising generation of Black women who are showing a lot of guts, what's your evaluation?
I like that. Can I take notes? I'm going to take notes here. You want to repeat the question?
Repeat. James is the attorney general who's prosecuting Trump in New York.
New York, yep.
And Fannie Willis is the DA prosecuting Trump in Georgia.
Yep.
And both are Black women.
I wish you talked to me. I could have thrown a slide together last second. No, actually, what I think is super interesting about that, thank you for your question, is they are showing a lot of courage. And then also, right, they have the jurisdiction, right? They have the authority, right? Because of the way the system is structured in the US, right? They don't have to answer to the federal government, the attorney general and Merrick Garland in the same way as others might. So no, I love that. I wish I thought of that. That's always the case with these presentations, but no, I agree. The other side about that, I do want to say, is in the same way that you have them advocate, is showing the courage that they're showing, and then being more on the politically progressive side, as Black women, you also have the other side. When you think about people who seek really harsh punishment for crimes and want to lock up people, right, in order to set themselves up for higher office. And so the DA role is one where I kind of have a love-hate relationship with, in terms of they can do a lot of good. And then, all these AGs, right? They can do a lot of good. They can also, I'll leave it at that. So, but I appreciate your question. Yeah.
Wasn't it also true? Kamala Harris had a reputation as being a pretty firm AG, right?
Oh, yeah, so, prosecutor. I mean, people. Yeah, that was part of.
So I guess, to build on that question, is that sort of crossover sentiment, if you will, like, so someone who's hard on crime, does that maybe have an effect on a Black woman in a general election?
So, okay, the thing that's interesting, I appreciate that question, is I think a lot of people in the Black community were upset with Harris, right? And some of the pushback that she received is because she was seen as so hard. The tough on crime has this disproportionate impact on Black people. And so holding that against her in some ways. But to your point, to the extent that the broader population likes that, right? And you think about your vectors, I don't know if it'll push her over. I don't know if they cancel each other out, right? Or I don't know if the negative effect, anyway, I don't know if it gets you over, but it should help ostensibly, right? That you're tough on crime. That's generally a message that's palatable with different types of voters. I have to think more about that. Yeah.
A question here from Dick Kaler.
Professor, forgive me because I'm going to offer a critique.
Okay.
and ask you to respond a little bit.
Okay.
And it's generated in part by the last gentleman's question, plus other things that you said earlier. My impression of your presentation was that it gave us a glass half empty view of Black women's success in politics. I think you could have used virtually the same slides, the same examples, and given a glass half full presentation of Black women's Black women's participation in important politics. And the single statistic that was most compelling to me, and you presented yourself as a statistics guy, the single most important factoid in those slides was that today 31 members of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives are Black women. That's 1 in 7 members of the Democratic representation. That is a hell of an accomplishment. When the other statistic said we've only had 59 of them in 50 some years since Shirley Chisholm. And so I would welcome you to consider that glass half empty versus glass half full presentation to your approach, because I have a pretty clear understanding of what your goal is in making the presentation, and I think you could strengthen it.
No, thanks for that. No, I appreciate the suggestion. And it's funny because I'm generally a glass half full person. I was interviewed for something related to Carolina and media or something, I don't know. And so I actually am an optimist. I actually have a paper, I have too many papers I'm working on, but that looks at the fact that even like during COVID, we were doing surveys of people, and Black respondents were more optimistic and more positive relative to other people. And so I actually had this idea about sort of that resilience in this glass half full. So it's actually a bit ironic because people that know me would describe me as more of how you were suggesting I should present things. No, I appreciate that. And so I think what I would say is, no, thank you for that. That's helpful. When I set out to do it, I didn't have that in mind in terms of being negative. And I just think for me, it's, when putting this all together and just thinking about the denominator, right? And 11,000 is it being troubling. But anyway, what I'll do is, I appreciate that. Point well taken. I'm going to make a note on that.
It's all right.
Sorry. I'll get your question right after.
In 1972, Angela Davis was being tried for murder in a California court.
And
in 1972, Eldridge Cleaver was head of the Black Panthers and was suspected of fomenting armed revolution against the established government. In the same year, Shirley Chisholm decides to run for president. So if you want to talk about your glass half full, talk about that.
Notes being taken. Okay, we have a question here from Pickett Guthrie.
My question is on voter turnout.
Yes.
You listed, I think 95% Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, and 95% voted for Biden. What would that turnout for Black women have been had it been a white man in those elections? In other words, voter turnout is very important. And that's a group that Democratic candidates are certainly counting on. So as we look forward to 24, what would you project when we talked about what would happen if we lost by Kamala Harris?
I think what might end up happening is I wouldn't expect support for the Republican Party. I might expect people to vote by not, or to protest and not vote. The tricky thing about that is what ends up happening is you help people win who you don't want to win. And one of the things that people know is true about Black people generally in politics is tend to be very pragmatic and recognize that working within the two-party system is in their interest. And so I don't know. Again, it's hard for me to give. I'm not trying to like dodge your question, but I think there are two sides to this, right? I think there might be some frustration, but then there's also this acknowledgement of, okay, if you don't turn out, the alternative is that Trump wins again, and that's far worse than right. And so I think at the end of the day, people would still turn out. I mean, I think the most fervor was for Obama, which I mean, I makes sense to me, right? For many reasons in terms of charisma and shared identity, right? And but I still think there is that. I think Black women still are very much supportive of the Democratic Party as a whole, and especially compared to white women as well. So, which I can't talk about, but again, I'm trying to emphasize Black women. Make them the center here.
If you'll humor a question from me, I'm curious about the other side of the aisle. We've a couple.
Oh yes,
I've got to build up a few points here. One is that after the 2012 election, there was a strategy among the GOP to make a wider tent.
Yep.
That certainly in terms of rhetoric might have narrowed after 2012, after 2016, in terms of rhetoric. However, there are Black politicians. You mentioned the race for the governor in North Carolina, people like Tim Scott as well. I'm curious and we've also seen that, in fact, Trump did better among Black male voters from the first election to the second election. So, and now I'm going to add one other wrinkle to it. I'm going to add the wrinkle of sort of religious conservatism and other aspects. So where are the inroads? Where are the splits between Black women and Black men? And what is it I guess, if you were a strategist for the GOP or something, what is the and I'm asking you to sort of step outside of anything and say, like, I'm just a political strategist. What are the vectors that influence Black men to turn to the Republican Party, although it's not major numbers? And how does this influence this talk? How might it impact some of the data you've given us?
Yeah, no, Max. So I thought about adding this to the presentation. There's this term called the gender gap. And so the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers has amazing data on women in office dating back to the 70s. And one of the things that they show, starting in 1980, they look at the Reagan-Carter election. They look at major party candidates. So maybe they have Perot in 92. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. What they show is that since that period of time, women, regardless of race, have been more supportive of the Democratic candidate for president, and men have been more supportive of the Republican candidate. And so they show that gap over time. And so that's one way I think about what's going on, like in the same way that, I mean, Black men are still men, right? And so that's partly why I think you see this gap between Black women and Black men. It's just that gender gap that exists for people of various racial and ethnic backgrounds. In terms of inroads, what's interesting to me is, and I talk with people a lot about this, if you look at levels of religiosity, and you think about some of the social conservatism that comes with that, there's room for the Republican Party to grow among Black voters. This is, I'll actually spending your time for me to tell you this. The difficult part for most Black voters is the race-based discrimination, acknowledgement of systemic racism and these broader factors. I mean, absent that, the GOP would be much more successful among Black people, because when it comes to some of these social issues, there's some alignment. There will still be some differences with the fiscal, how much should you pay in taxes? Should government guarantee health care? Some of these things that the Democratic Party is in favor of, that Blacks are as well. But I think the way the Republican Party has dealt with race since 1964 is really the breaking point with Goldwater and them not supporting the Civil Rights Act and Johnson being behind it. Since that point is where you've seen the real shift.
It was accurate to say that in 2012, there was this moment where the Republican Party was having some self-reflection, right? About
but then Trump gets the nomination, right?
Yeah. So I had a question here. Miriam, did you have a question as well? Okay, we'll start with Miriam. And I also want to remind folks in the online audience that we have some questions coming in. So I'll get those. We'll do Miriam.
Okay, so you talked about the confirmation hearing of Kavanaugh versus Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I'm just wondering, I have my own, obviously, opinions about that. And you brought up his, aggressive stance versus her calm demeanor, which there's lots of data that shows that has to go that way or else.
Yep.
But how do you think the increasing acceptance of incivility and the
Oh,
terrible language that
Mhm.
people are now using and how accepting we've
Mm.
become of that
Mm.
is going to affect
Mm.
particularly Black women,
Yeah.
because now it's okay to go after, and there's this sea of silence
Yeah.
coming out of the people who should be kind of giving us a better example of civility.
Gosh. So I'm gonna tell a bit of a story. I'm gonna ask you a question, but I want to tell a bit of a story. So we was talking about the identity-based caucuses and some of the research I'm doing with co-authors. We started this before the 2020 general election. And so we actually heard from knowledgeable sources. So we were able to have one interview with a black woman member of Congress before January 6, 2021. I should just go there, shouldn't I? We only have so much time. After that, and thinking about people who were hiding under their desk in fear and the trauma of that. And so again, I know everyone experienced that. I acknowledge that. When Black women, there was, right, there's this other layer of fear, right? And already being in a space where this instability existed, and there's this sense of, right, you're grossly underrepresented, and so there aren't a lot of people like you. We haven't been able to get an interview, and we tried. I mean, my co-author Nadia is amazing, like one of the leading scholar on Black women in politics, has written books using qualitative methods. We cannot get a response, and we think it's because of the consequences of what happened. And so, to get to your point, I think it actually is really scary. And you can even extend this to women of color, someone like AOC, and just some of the outright just anger and just even violence that people seem to want to inflict harm on folks. I think Black women will experience that in a way that's different, and in a way I think will make their experience in the institution just much less pleasant. I mean, there's more to it. I'm trying to find the words, but yeah, it's going to make it really challenging. I don't know if people will step out of the institution and just choose to not serve any longer, but it definitely is going to add to the stress. And as I've been reading more and more and thinking more about environments and race, I mean, there actually are people who study this and show that when you're underrepresented, like some of the physiological responses, the higher blood pressure. So are they going to be willing to give of their life and literally like put their health on the line to serve their constituents? And that's a decision that is different, right? It is different. So anyway, I hope I answered your question. I wasn't. What's that? Yeah, no, I am. I mean, I think, and that's more. So I'm thinking maybe more Congress. So Maryland is, I mean, just go to Maryland, because Maryland's sweet, right? I mean, you've got Democratic state, you've got power. So there are going to be certain pockets that I think are going to be better. But this is more in terms of the emergence of. So going back to your question about the optimism and the growth, right? Seeing the growth to 31, whereas in 19, it was, Chisholm was the only one until Barbara Jordan and I think Curtis Collins and some others showed up. Oh, somebody had another question. I'm waxing on.
We have some questions also from the online audience, but let's take a question from in-house and then we'll go to the online audience.
Vice President Kamala Harris was in Durham, I know, a couple of times. Right before I came here, I heard on the news that her husband was going to be they were talking about the first gentleman is going with President Biden to do something somewhere. And I just wondered if I'm the only person who feels I don't hear enough about her or where she is or what she's doing or.
I appreciate what you're saying. I think thinking about this idea of who might replace her, and I've heard people say that they were hoping that she would have a more prominent role. So I think back to VP Biden, right? You see him and Obama, right? They seem like bosom buddies, right? And Biden was there to help with negotiate healthcare or foreign policy, and it seems like he was pictured more prominently with President Obama. So you juxtapose that with Biden, and we'll hear about his aviator glasses and his love for ice cream and Amtrak, but you don't see, right? It's not the same. And so, no, I appreciate what you're saying. And I think for some, there was this hope that maybe, VP Harris would have a more direct role. Because even I myself, as someone that studies this, I'm trying to think like, what is it? What do I think of, right? What's the policy or what's the, yeah. Oh, so the tiebreaker. So that was a constraint. I didn't think about that. That's a good point. I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Great. All right,
Well,
let's-
she probably was glad though, because it could have.
Let-
If Georgia didn't go the way it went, but I hear you. I didn't think.
Let's take a question from our online audience, and I see hands up, and so we'll get to those in just a moment. Margaret Avery, hello out there. Margaret is wondering, what about Barbara Jordan,
Oh, I love
successful
Barbara
Black
Jordan.
woman politician of the South, and
Yes.
what can you say about her? Why didn't she
Oh.
figure in your presentation?
Oh, that's a failure on my part. I love Bar. I wrote that capstone project on Jordan. I have a book that I bought. I should have brought it with you. It brought it with me. Like literally, it was written in the late 1970s. I forget. It was Barbara Jordan and someone else wrote it with her. And like I have like notes that I've scribbled. And so Barbara Jordan is someone I'm also a huge fan of. Thinking about like how, and I like thinking about how she compares to Shirley Chisholm in particular. So Barbara Jordan has this quote, she's not neither black nor a woman, she's just a politician. That's like a quote that she put out there. Whereas you had Chisholm, who talked about being a black woman and helped create the Black Caucus and the Women's Caucus. So that's I'm a huge fan of Jordan. This presentation, maybe didn't reflect that. Well, it didn't, but I'm a huge fan. And Barbara, moving forward, I want Jordan to play a key role in the book because I think about how she navigated a space. She would smoke cigarettes with and hang out with the Texas delegation. She sat with the Texas delegation instead of with other Black members in Congress. So like, these are all things I know. Give me another 30 minutes, Max.
Yeah.
I'll be sure to add it. But thank you. I really appreciate the question.
Thank you, Margaret. We have a question here from Chris.
It was actually just a comment on one of the last questions, which is I think that the difference between Biden and Obama as a pair and Kamala Harris and Biden as a pair is the shared background in the legislature, the federal legislature, that just, they got their juices going by, doing all that legislative experience. And hers is just so different that I can see why there might not be that, that, wow, let's just get together and kill this thing.
But she was a senator.
Yeah, I know, but it's still just not the long legislative.
Yeah.
history.
No, come from a prosecutor. No, I appreciate that idea. Yeah, I love conjecture. Thank you for that. It's interesting to think about. I talked about previous experience, right? I mean, Obama served, I think, 7 years or so in the Illinois legislature, served in the U.S. Senate. And so, and then the other thing too, I would add is identity matters as well, right? Because these are two guys, right? And they go, so that's not lost to me as well. So anyway, thank you for that.
Another question from Sam.
I know it was off your election, but I'm curious about the turnout and support in the African American community of Cheri Beasley. Was that diminished somewhat? Were there a breakdown on gender lines, or has the data really been analyzed?
So I haven't analyzed the data. I actually, this past summer, UNC has this wonderful program called the Institute for African American Research. I won't say acronyms. It's called IAR Slate. There's too many acronyms, right? I mean, you throw a rock, you hit one here at UNC. Anyway, outstanding students. And one of the students I worked with actually looked at the campaign and looked at the rhetoric that was used and looked at, how much time do we have? 5:50. Looked at the use of the term woke, and which taps into ideology and portraying her as like this very progressive politician, despite the fact that she's Chief Justice, she actually was more moderate, center left. But anyway, thinking about the role that played and how that might have had some impact on her on support. But that didn't look at voter turnout, nothing concrete, but something I would definitely like to look into. The story I've heard is that the Democratic Party itself wasn't as supportive of her as it could have been in terms of like the actual party and providing money. I'll say one other thing. Again, this doesn't directly answer your question, but what I'm struck by, thinking about experience, right, and previous experience, and how much variation there was between Beasley and her opponent. But like, not that Bud had never been in office, but like it was really a marked difference in terms of previous experience. And to the extent that previous experience is a factor, right? It's just something that I think is worth noting. To go back to your comment about optimism, because I appreciate that. It's worth noting she was a lot closer than she would have been 20 years ago, right? And so it wasn't like she earned 20% of the vote, right? She was quite competitive. It's like you get right there, right? And maybe that's what it is. Like to win primaries. We're seeing Black women win primaries. We're seeing Black women win primaries in the South. This almost is cuss worthy, but I'm not right. Dang. Shoot, dadgum. I do my Roy, but dadgum. All right, that's a big. Is that what he said? Dadgun, whatever. I know about the point. I like basketball. That's a huge deal. I don't want to discount that. And I shouldn't discount that. I want to see the general election win. And I'll come in and win out. Yeah.
We have some CPH questions here, Beth.
Uh-oh.
I was just wondering if you had any data or perspective on successful strategies for engaging Black women in political life, or that candidates have found in finding success in running for office. If you have any data about what have been the successful ways of engaging or finding wins.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot more success at lower levels, right? So congressional districts, city council, mayoral elections. I didn't mention Lori Lightfoot. I thought about Lightfoot, but somebody else. I didn't. Or Karen Bass, right? She Los Angeles. Boy, I mean, oh my goodness! You talk about a big city and then complicate. I mean, boy, LA is. You teach a whole class about Los Angeles politics, right? I still remember Rodney. I was a young guy. I remember Rodney King, Tom Bradley, 1982, the Bradley effect. Anyway, that's all to say. There are Black women in these powerful positions, right? So, and Bass was she was Speaker of the House in California, and then she was a member of Congress in California, and now Mayor of LA. So I definitely think, outside of the gubernatorial elections, outside of these statewide elections, we are seeing success. It's the high profile elections. Yeah. So there was a paper. I was part of the special issue with Nadia and Anna and or Doctors Brown and Mahoney. Let me use the title here. But they're my friends. Anyway, we were working together, and I'm not trying to disrespect them. Right? Now I'm going back to my head like, am I not calling them by their title? They're my friends. So we were writing this piece, or editing the special issue, and there was a piece about Black women, in their efforts at mobilizing other Black women. So them like their own mobilization networks. So kind of taking it into their own hands instead of waiting on the party apparatus, doing it themselves. So, and it's called like, was it Sisters something? It's a great title. I'm like forgetting it offhand, but it's about the New Georgia Project. Yeah, Stacey Abrams. I mean, so there is evidence of that. Yep.
We have a question here, Lloyd Kramer.
Lloyd with a question. I got to brace myself now.
No.
In 1990,
there's a follow-up.
1890. Here we go. Reconstruction.
No. About this issue of social conservatism or religious conservatism among Black women and the abortion issue, whether it cuts a little differently among Black women.
Yeah.
And I actually heard some pundits or analysts say on Sherry Beasley that she did very well among Black voters, but there was 6 or 8% of Black women who would have been more supportive, who just didn't come out to vote. And the polling suggested because they were too ambivalent about her very clear pro-abortion stance. And that 6 or 8%, makes a difference. Do you have any sense on abortion politics among Black women politicians?
I see. Thank you, Lloyd. You almost thought I would have planted that question. So in this project that we're working on, that's in the works. Where is this? This project, we have a state one of the states we're looking at, and there was a Black woman who introduced an abortion bill that was more in the conservative end, and some Black women were with her, and some were against her. So that's just all to say. I think what you're picking up on is the fact that there is this difference, right? This I love the word heterogeneity. I don't know why, but this variation that exists, right, among Black women. And it's tricky because on the one hand, right, I want to think about how Black women are unified, right? But then I also want to think about how they're not monolithic. And so we're trying to hold both of these things in tension. But it doesn't surprise me, right? Because there are a lot of people who have these really strong convictions. And going back to Max's question, I think if the GOP didn't have the stance they had on race, it'd be a lot more successful among Black voters, including Black women. But I think that's what ends up keeping people, from being really closely wedded to it. But yeah, no, it definitely is something that can divide folks. Yep.
You beat me to it. Let's put our hands together.
You
for
saw
Chris and you come back up and say goodbye in just a moment. I'm going to just make a few announcements, and then we'll bring you back up for a final. We clap for you 3 times.
I get clapped 3
times. You always clap for you 3 times. Well, this is wonderful. Thanks again for this wonderful talk. I just want to let you folks know Humanities in Action is back. Next week, we have a person who definitely has opinions. Gene Nickel will be here next week talking about poverty in North Carolina and beyond. After that, I want to say, don't come 2 weeks from now, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But on November 1st, we continue with Humanities in Action with the democratization of AI with Professor Mark McNeely. The reason that we have a little break is that we also want to encourage you folks, please come and listen to some music with us. We have the very remarkable Dawn Landis coming for the Flyleaf Music Series. These are the last Wednesdays of the month. So instead of Humanities in Action, we switch it up with music. Dawn Landis is absolutely a fabulous singer-songwriter. She's worked with Nora Jones, Jason Isbell, all sorts of famous people. And is in her own right has really wonderful work. And so it's about 70% performance, about 30% discussion of career life themes in her music. So please consider coming out. A little change of pace. Sometimes these political topics get a little heavy, so consider that. I also want to make sure that you folks know about our upcoming weekend seminars, including our next weekend seminar on transformation and decline in the late Roman Empire. And we're going to be looking in particular at Egypt and Spain. So it's an interesting look at regions of the area. I guess things fall apart on the edges before they fall apart in the middle there. And also a look at opera with a wonderful Tim Carter on November 18th. I do want to thank, of course, our sponsors, the Cotton Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, the North Carolina Honor Society, and Carolina Alumni. And let's put our hands together for Flyleaf Books, a fantastic bookstore, and our wonderful staff, Beth Gardner and Paul Bonici, making sure everybody out there can see it. And of course, our director, Lloyd Kramer here, always has the questions. So thank you, Lloyd, for being here. One more time, come on up, Chris. Put your hands together for Christopher Clark. Take it away. Great. Thanks so much. We'll see you all next time, everybody.